Hi, this is Geoff Berry, and welcome to the Nature Calling channel, where we aim to deepen connection to the earth and to the spirit of life and to all our kin on this beautiful planet. Okay, well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for giving us this time and coming along to the Nature Calling channel. George Burns, clinical psychologist, and really must have been a very open-minded one back in the 90s to start the kind of research you were doing, to come out with nature-guided therapy in 98, brief integrative strategies for health and well-being. So I think, still working in the field, I was so happy I started looking you up and thought, he wouldn't possibly still be around and available.
Oh, thanks.
You never know. 98 seems a fair while now.
It does, yeah.
So before I've got a few prompts which I know that we'll really enjoy to talk about, but can you give us a little feel for how it felt in those days to come out with that book then?
Yeah, it was something, from my own background. And fortunately, I had parents who brought me up with contact with nature. Dad who built a tree house in our backyard that my sister and I would climb into and listen to birds singing and watch bugs crawl along leaves and things. And so, I think that value was always there from my parents. I knew the benefits in my life. And when I was working in prisons, I was working in a fairly behavioural model. I started to develop a scale to look at what might be positive reinforcers for prisoners, and found that nature items were the things that commonly came up. And this, on the basis of a scale inventory that I developed, this continued to be for other people too. So, there was an international conference in Melbourne. I was asked to present. I put up 3 possible abstracts, and surprisingly, they chose the one on nature-guided work. So I then had to present a paper,
You didn't have it yet.
which made me research it and look at what was out there.
Yeah.
And at that stage in the area of psychology and therapy, there was very little. Most of the research came out of social geography, anthropology, architecture, fields like this. And it was in the profession. Because psychology has tended to look very inward. I think it was Roszak who said that Freud toiled under the misconception of separating person from planet, and looked very inwardly towards the person. But we are part of a system. We're part of the system of family. We're part of the system of the extended world around us. We're part of the system of our contact with nature out there. But at that stage, as I said, it sounded fringy, and a lot of people weren't tuning into that. They were looking very inwardly rather than our bigger relationship with all of the systems that are around us.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in context. Freud and then Jung, what they were trying to do was move away from their previous models. So, standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. But how much different is it now? I feel like I tried to launch some ecotherapy stuff a few years ago to crickets. Really, not a lot of action. Just the last year or two, everything seems to be going crazy, and everyone wants to get that back, get that feeling of kinship in nature back.
I think so, and unfortunately, what's happening with global warming and the threats to the planet. I think it's highlighted people's awareness of this in some ways, and we're realizing our vulnerability, our dependency on nature, and we need to value that if we want to preserve it.
Mm. It's somewhat ironic that at the very point that nature's showing us that we are not in control, and and we're clearly suffering. I mean, I'm laughing, but I am on the edge of the mega fire, and we were actually very, very lucky about a southerly change on the morning of New Year's Day 2020, and now the floods this year. I mean, we're really starting to cop it at that very moment that, in a sense, nature's paying us back, to be a bit metaphorical. So many people are saying, oh, I actually give people a lot of credit. So many people are saying this is because we got the relationship wrong. We've actually got to be kinder to nature and connect with it and get that feeling back to treat it better, basically.
Yeah. That's right, and I think you highlight a point there too, and that helps in our clarity in terms of what we're talking about with nature, because nature is not always benevolent. Nature doesn't always make us happy. As you know from your own experience, there are fires, there are floods, there are cyclones, there are snakes, there are poisonous spiders. When we talk of nature in therapy, we're talking about the availability of it, but also the quality of it, and that's the quality of nature, where we can feel engaged in a way that is safe and conducive to us, but also restorative and building and inspiring. So when we're looking at nature in terms of therapy, we are defining it fairly specifically in those terms and aspects of nature. Yeah.
That's a really good call, and I think I try to break down those levels a bit and open that conversation out with, because the people I'm training are therapists adding ecotherapy to their practice. So there's already a certain level there of understanding where I can say, okay, so we have healing, so we have wounds that like to be healed, and that's one thing we can do in a connection to nature, and we have empowerment for disenfranchised people, and we have flow, there's nothing wrong with the wellness aspect of people who are otherwise perfectly fine, finding another dimension or another level in nature and just getting back some flow and some feeling of connection and another level. And I've gotten a fair bit of that out of your work. I don't know how much you mean to do this, but I always feel a lot of joy when I read your stuff. And and I think the sensory inventory, for me, I really noticed, there's the one that was cited in Linda Buzzell and Craig Chalquist's ecotherapy book, but I know is also in your original book, and you've cited it elsewhere about the traveling couple, and asking them what makes you happy, and then using that as a way to sort of move away from whatever challenges are coming their way. And I love that. It's there's a part of us that wants to celebrate being alive and
absolutely
with the planet. And so I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit more. I mean, you talked about your treehouse. You've obviously got a love of nature embedded. We spoke before about, like me, you live near the ocean, and I've been getting in the ocean. But I think people really like examples. Can you think of a concrete example that, where you introduce someone to getting their joy back in nature?
Yes, a case that I have written about with the permission of the client, and let me perhaps give that succinctly. But it was one of those cases, and I hope I'm not the only clinician, the only therapist around that sits down with the first session with someone and thinks, where the hell do I go?
I'm pretty sure that's close to universal, isn't
it? Yeah, but this was someone who was referred because she was depressed and had hundreds of reasons to be depressed. She'd been involved in a couple of motor vehicle accidents. She'd got ill health. She'd got children, a couple who were at risk of developing Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease. She reported a history of sexual abuse by her father, but felt that it was her obligation to be looking after him in his older age, and was really torn in that. Struggling with other things within her family. The story went on, and and things in her life that were just not going to change. Some things that were way beyond her control. And so in the first interview, I did just talk with her along the basis of the inventory you mentioned, the sensory awareness inventory, and just asked her, well, what are the things that you get pleasure, relaxation, or enjoyment out of in your sense of sight, in your sense of smell, in what you hear, what you taste, the tactile sensations, just working through our basic senses. And the one thing that she came up with was her rose garden. She just loved being out among the roses, working among the roses. And she was just one of those most delightful people to work with, because at the end of the first session, she wrote me a letter. In fact, she wrote after pretty much every session. She came into our sessions by train, and the first letter I got was, as I sat on the train going home, I started to think about the roses. I imagined making rose petal stew to feed my husband, to put rose candles on the table, to sprinkle rose petals around the bed.
Wow.
Some other ideas that I won't expand on. And she said,
being creative.
She started to smile and giggle, and she said people on the train were separating themselves away from her. And when she was walking down the street back to her house, she burst out laughing out loud and wrote and said, "This is the first time I have laughed in years."
No.
Now, for me, did that change everything in her life? No, it didn't. But what it did was open up a glimmer of hope for her. What it did was open up a tool that was available there that she could use when life's going to get tough. It opened up opportunities for her to develop, and she did, and went on and did really well from someone who'd been suffering such a major depression in the first place. So I think even if we can just bring that glimmer of light into a window for someone, and often that contact with nature, as it was for her and the things that she valued, it was a resource that was coming from her, not something that I imposed as a therapist.
Right.
And she found and discovered that, and as I said, went on to do really well. So I don't know if that addresses the
No, it's a fabulous example, because in a sense, partly what I heard was, I take a meditation practice or any kind of awareness exercises, which of course we do in ecotherapy all the time. I just take them really seriously. I think they're really, essential kind of practices. And what I was hearing too was partly you've got all this stuff going on in your mind, and for her, a considerable amount of trauma. But there is something else in there that you're simply not giving too much attention to. And maybe you could and she's opened up that part. You've guided her to open that part and found all this joy and beauty and pleasure, and that's going to refresh her. No, I think it's a perfect example. I mean, I've heard you speak before too about positive psychology and about finding a way of thinking about ourselves that's not a deficit model. What's right with us instead of what's wrong with us.
Yes. Yeah, well, just following on the first point that you made there, Geoff, good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Michael Yapko, is very well known for his work with hypnosis and depression. He's author of the world's major book, Trance Work in Hypnosis, into I think its 5th edition or something by now. Yeah. And he speaks about a very core principle here, and that is that what we attend to is what we amplify.
Okay. I haven't heard that one.
And yes, and so this applies for anything. You get stuck in ruminative, depressive thoughts. They're going to amplify. Yeah. They're going to be big and overwhelming. They're going to wake you up at night. They're going to be there during your day, and you're going to feel lousy. Yeah. You start to think about the roses. You start to amplify your experiences, your sensory awarenesses of those. That starts to bring joy. We start to amplify and magnify that. The same as when you said about, focusing on meditation. You start to meditate, and what you put your attention on is then what you amplify, and consequently what you experience.
Mm.
So it is a lot of just shifting attention,
Yeah.
and nature has the great resource that it absorbs so many senses. It has the great resource that it's different from a built environment. I look out my window, I see bushes, I see water, I see across to adjoining Point Perrin with a beach and shapes of hills. You know, it's soft, it's gentle, it's modified, the tones are varying. It's not like your straight geometric walls of looking out your office or your home onto another building that are all painted the same monotonal colour. Nature gives those great variations for us to be able to put our attention into, and these, a lot of the theorists are saying these are far more natural for us. This is the environment that we evolved in, and so they are far more natural for us. So
you're just speaking my language, George. I love it. I part of my PhD was tracking urban civilization. And I said, look, isn't it funny? We think that cities are now a natural environment. Like, people don't walk around cities thinking this is strange, there should be a hill here. Well, some do, but it's become a natural environment. Whereas we have this primal need, I believe, to see and the other thing I love about your work, all the senses, to see hills, to hear birds, to feel sand. I just think there's something that's intrinsic. And as we know, over 90% of our evolution was in close contact with nature. It doesn't matter if we're white Westerners or tribal people still. That's how we...
Yeah. And that's where some of the theorists are saying there's a mismatch, that our brains evolved in that context, and now we've put them in a context that's very different, and consequently this is what's led to a lot of the problems that we have. Why we're seeing major escalating amounts of depression, for example, I think the most diagnosed disease in the world now. And we've only, if you put it on a 12-hour clock schedule, it's only a minute or two of that time that we've actually lived in built environments.
Yeah, fair call. And and isn't it interesting that the metaphor of the shape of a city, it's a grid, it's a block, it's almost like a prison, really, in a sense. It's like a large open block that's so unnatural. Yes. That we're walking these straight lines and doing things by the clock. Doesn't matter how you feel at 9 a.m. Off you go. I think it's probably, as you say, it's that last minute of the clock. It's probably quite difficult for us in our more innate being. Something subconscious in it is saying, God, I don't like this.
No.
I'd really rather be just, doing whatever I wanted whenever I please. That's a bit utopian, but there's definitely something natural we're missing. And
there's been some interesting studies done on this too, and studies like where they request people to walk for an hour in a busy city street and walk for an hour in nature, and comparing 1 hour, one walk a week to 3 or 4 walks a week. And where people do the walks in nature instead of busy streets, they reduce psychotropic medication that they take. They reduce hypertension medication. Several others, are down because of that added time walking in nature. You start to look where people have access to nature too, and it's not just the medication, but the disease factors that diminish. In nature, we're physically better. We're psychologically better, we're socially better, and spiritually better too. And interestingly, on those, I was just reading a recent article too, where somebody in the US across 6 cities had been studying where there were vacant blocks, and they went in no socioeconomic areas. Yeah. And they split them in thirds. Some blocks they cleaned and greened. Some blocks they just cleaned. Others they left just in the rubbish dumps that they were, basically. And they found that in the 2 treatment ones where they cleaned and greened, and even where they just cleaned, then there was less social problems, less violence, less gun incidents. And they projected this across one city, the city of Philadelphia, and it would work out that if you did this over the whole city to something like 350 less gun incidents per annum, just by greening vacant blocks that are there.
Wow, that's not a huge structural change, right?
It's not a huge structural change at all. And I mean, heaps of research out there. It's exciting what a lot of people are doing in looking at these areas now.
Yeah, you can hardly keep up with the amount of research that's coming out now. And I suppose, in a sense, it's really been researchers who recognize that, we like proof, we like scientific evidence, we like our outcomes and so forth. But I suspect most of the people working in the field probably knew, this is something we have to prove because it's so obvious. Like, so let's get the evidence.
Well, it is, isn't it?
Really? I think so. George, there's a couple of other things I wanted to go towards, and I'm actually going to switch the order because we sort of already started a little bit on the psychic connection between psyche and nature. So, for instance, your people around those blocks, less gun incidents, less crime around a clean block, especially a green block, than one that's left rubbishy. It's almost like an aesthetic response at a subconscious level as well. But people going into nature and seeing things, and that affecting their story, because I see this all the time with people in nature, and sometimes it can be very, very simple. A river moving around a rock, a tree leaning towards the sunlight, enabling someone to think, look, that's right. It's in my very nature to want to keep growing and flowing, and that's the way the whole world works, and I'm part of the world, so that I can see myself feeling that better. But it happens in lots of ways, lots of obscure and different ways. And I know you have a love for metaphor and stories like I do. So I'd love to hear, have you got another kind of case where you've been with someone in nature and they've really seen something in nature that's helped them to heal?
Yes. As you say that, I recall a young woman, a single mum, in her 30s, of a couple of children, and the first time that I saw her, she was referred by her GP. Her head was bandaged, her face was bruised, her eyes were swollen, and this was something like 16 days after the incident. And what had happened is that she worked in a shopping centre. A guy had stalked her there, followed her home, waited, and fortunately till the kids had gone to bed, then broke in, beat her unconscious with a baseball bat and raped her. It was not surprised that she was traumatized.
Yeah, that's
and so, again, the question was, what might be helpful for this person? We used the sensory awareness inventory. We started to engage in some nature exercises. She was understandably frightened of going out of the house at first, so we did some of those in meditative, mindful ways, using what I call nature-guided mindfulness. She started to get out and visit the park. And she got to a point where some weeks later, she said to me, I think I'd like to go to a farm retreat and just take several days out. She came back from that, actually brought me a photograph because she'd taken a walk out into the bush from this farm stay where she was staying, and she found this pool, pond out there, which had her reflection in it. And she looked at this, and she picked up a pebble and threw it into the pool, and it sent out the ripples and disrupted the whole reflection that she was seeing. And then again, it settled down and calmed down. And she said, this was just like what's happened to me. She said it was like pebble had been thrown into the pool of my life and really upset it. But she said, as I watched it, I realized that things just naturally settled down again. And that those reflections came back, and I could see myself and see the reflections of the trees and that around me in the pool. This is what I refer to, Geoff, as an experiential metaphor. And when I'm working with metaphors, I'm usually working at several different levels. One is the therapist-generated one, which is, like you said, where as a therapist I can come up with a story about a tree growing in a place of adversity, or a stream finding its way over all the rocks, or things like this. I can relate a journey of my own into nature, or tell another client story. I can try and elicit client-generated metaphors, and that is based around the question, well, what nature contact have you had that's had some meaning or some significance for you? And a metaphor really is where we use one example to parallel another. You say he's got, eagle-like eyes. I mean, he doesn't really have eagle eyes, but you saying something graphic about that. It adds colour to our speech, and that's the metaphor. There's no literal colour in our speech, but
there you go. Yeah.
And so metaphors are used to communicate something while using another example. So you as a therapist can generate them. You can invite your client to come up with experiences they might have had in the past, or you can set up exercises that put them in contact with nature and invite them to discover what meaning that there might be in that for them. And so this example of this young woman is one of those experiential metaphors where I set up an assignment for her when she said she was going off to the farm stay. I invited her to, discover what she might in that time away. She started to do a search for meaning. I had no idea what might come out of that she might come back and bring me this photograph of this pool. But she found her meaning, and that's what's important.
It's such a great example because it's also such an extreme case. We're not just talking about wellness for privileged people here. We're talking about healing trauma. It's in cases where, as you said rightly, so what do I do here? What can I possibly say to help this person? But I just quickly jotted down a note because I love the way you said you had no idea how this was going to pan out too. And of course, that's another theme in nature healing in general. We are no longer in control once we're out there. Anything can happen. It takes a little bit of courage and experience to be around that and to let go and let nature do its work.
Yeah. I think, Geoff, there's a bit of a bottom line here, and I think that if I look on my work, it's been about wanting to create and open up experiences for people. And once you start to create that opportunity that somebody might experience something a bit differently from the way that they have been, you've got no idea what that experience might be or where they might go with it. But you have the ability, and I learned this a bit out of the work of Milton Erickson, to just utilise whatever your client brings back. And, there's no point in me saying, oh, no, that isn't what I meant by a walk in the bush at the farm stay. You weren't supposed to throw a stone in the pot. It's a matter of, accepting what my client brings back and building on that. So it's opening those opportunities for experience and helping the person experience and discover meaning and purpose for them in that experience.
And what I'm hearing too is having some faith, that it can happen. It's happened for you. It's happened for me. And I've seen it happen so many times. Agreed. I think these experiential metaphors, definitely my favorite. I love nothing better than taking a group into nature and saying, okay, let's see.
Exactly.
It comes, because there's always a way. And even as you say, right, as you said right back at the start, nature's dangerous. I mean, it's going to kill us all in the end. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah,
But on the path, what amazing lessons we can learn.
indeed. Yeah.
Lovely. And speaking too of extreme cases, I know that you helped set up a rehab center in, well, I've never visited, but it's ideally one of my favorite places on earth, Bhutan, simply for the very famous gross national happiness.
Yes.
But a rehab center with nature therapy sounds like a bit of a world first. Can you tell us a bit about it and what has worked? What's worked there? And what you think might be transferable, to keep that ball rolling elsewhere as well, maybe.
Oh, look, I certainly hope it is. We spoke about, or you mentioned about positive psychology before. We didn't really get into that, but I think it ties in very closely with what we're doing with nature therapy. Bhutan back in 1972 with the previous king, the fourth king, when his coronation, he said he was more interested in gross national happiness than gross national product. And so that took off. Bhutan has it defined very well. There are four core pillars of their happiness policy. One of those is environmental conservation. It's written into the constitution that 60% of the country will stay under virgin forest forever.
Wow.
I think about 70% is at the moment. And there's a Gross National Happiness Commission, which I suppose is a bit like our EPA, that any planning in Bhutan has to go before this and say, well, is this planning, is this development in the interests of the happiness of our people?
Fantastic.
Actually, if I screen share, I've got a couple of slides about it if you're interested to
let's have a look.
Let's
certainly something that a lot of people would not have heard of before. I think it's got a lot of potential.
Yeah, so Geoff, the project, and let me say, I've been going to Bhutan for more than 2 decades now, and taken groups of colleagues there on study tours, and again, that's a bit opening up experience for colleagues to do that. But for the last 12 years or so, I've been working there as a volunteer and spending up to 3 months a year there. Was the country's first psychologist. But this particular project was a product of the Bhutan Youth Development Fund, a local agency that worked and had support from the Asia Development Bank. And our remit was to set up a new youth drug and alcohol rehab centre based on the country's philosophy of happiness and well-being, but also bringing in the science and evidence-based approaches of the West. So very, very exciting of blending these two cultures and working with the locals to do it. So the rehab centre is actually set in this absolutely lovely spot. You've got a gate there at the front, an open gate that leads in the road. You come in through trees and babbling brooks. When I was there last, it was at the foundation stage. It's now been built, but because of COVID, I've not been back at this stage, so I haven't seen it. But here is the centre. And it's in this beautiful valley surrounded by these lovely native forests, with a very holy monastery just sitting right above it there. The stream runs through down the bottom here, and it's just an absolutely lovely environment. But very, very typically of Bhutan, and I looked at volunteering in Mongolia a while ago, and that was with a women's agency. It was called the National Council Against Violence, and its title, National Council, it's very authoritarian, it's against, it highlights the violence in it. Bhutan's similar agency for women is called Renew, standing for Restore, Educate, Nurture, Empower Women. So, as Shakespeare said, what's in a name? Well, I think a name makes a difference.
Oh, a different approach.
Yes, and they decided this too with the rehab. So it's not called a rehab. It's the Bhutan Institute of Wellbeing.
Uh-huh.
And this is straight from their own website. They offer a 3-month holistic nature gross national happiness inspired treatment and rehabilitation program that we called the happiness model, and including these therapeutic aspects to it. So the positive psychology comes in, human development aspects, the mindfulness, contemplative therapies that tie in very closely with the Buddhist culture, very strong Buddhist culture that it is.
Mm.
Evidence-based approaches from cognitive behavior therapy, motivational enhancement therapy. We looked at the systemic approaches too of the family and the systems that the people were in, and nature-guided therapy, which, as far as I know, is the first rehab facility in the world to incorporate this into its programs.
Awesome.
And the basis of the happiness model was, and of course, you know, the pharmacotherapy, the use of medications were appropriate too. But the basis of the happiness model was based on, what are the reasons that people turn to drugs? And if they are happy, do they need drugs or alcohol to be sustaining them in the way that they have been relying on them? So if we're helping a person to create greater levels of happiness and well-being, rather than aiming at just the cessation of the approach behaviors, the maladaptive approach behaviors, if we're aiming at creating the positive rather than just eliminating the negative, is this a better way to go? And so this fits in very much with the country's philosophy. That was the model that we developed. And
right. And
if I could throw in a little commercial, if anyone's got some spare funds that they want to donate, the Bhutan Youth Development Fund is a really worthy cause for that one too.
Yeah, look, I'll drop the link in the intro to the clip.
Yeah,
so people can follow that up if they want to.
Yeah. And thinking Bhutan, do we have time for me to share a little story too?
Yeah, I do. Everyone loves a story, George. Me as much as anyone else.
This I love. This the image that's there is Bhutan's national story. And you'll see this painting in government offices, in monasteries, in the hospital, in banks, in homes, and you'll see it's a very nature-based story. It's there among the trees, the waterfalls, the rivers, the mountains of Bhutan. But the story is of a pheasant who found a seed and wanted to plant it. The rabbit came along and asked what it was doing and offered to dig a hole and help to bury the seed. The monkey came along and offered his assistance too, and he stood and guarded this seedling as it started to grow. The elephant saw its friends and offered to help as well, so it went down to the water, gathered the water in its trunk, brought it back and watered the tree until the tree grew and fruited. But the fruit was high. And so what these 4 faithful friends, as the story is called, formed this pyramid, got together to harvest the fruit and share. And to me, it's just a beautiful story of a systemic story of coming together with different resources and different skills to share and contribute into the environment.
Yeah,
so Bhutan's national story, yeah.
No, we need a national story. This is new to me. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
The thing I love about it, apart from it, clearly having that ecotherapeutic background of the tree growing and the animals working together to help that to happen, is it so community based, and it's clearly one of our problems in the modern West, or now in the modern global village, is competitiveness, is the competitiveness of capitalism and our isolation as individuals in that context.
Yes, and And loneliness and isolation is a major problem in our
Mm.
cities. I mean, the bigger the cities, the more people come together, the higher the rates of loneliness, the higher the rates of mental illness, the higher the rates of psychoses. Uh,
So many people, but it's got no soul. That's the old
yeah,
song goes.
exactly. Yeah.
Kind of ironic.
Mm,
But it also brings to mind, and we're in unscripted territory now, but, we've had a story, so let's roll with it. And I have heard you speak to this before, so I'm not, it's not too big of a stretch, but I think it's perfectly clear that we have some big time community issues, coming our way with anthropogenic climate change.
mm,
So we still have the isolation, the loneliness. I think nature connection can clearly help to
mm,
dissolve some of that, because when you feel connected to the environment around you, you
mm,
can overcome some of your sense of isolation, because you don't feel isolated in a living world that you're a part of and connected to. Ecotherapy, I think, in general, works beautifully with people too.
mm,
I go to it for nature, but then I work in groups. That's my work. And then in groups, we all find things in each other that seems nicer or more palatable, because we're all rediscovering ourselves in nature. But
mm,
I'm starting to get more and more interested in what we're going to do about community programs to help with things like the fires and the floods,
mm.
and really breaking ecotherapy out of a one-on-one or even small group, and how we're going to start to go ahead with these big issues.
Yeah, and they are big issues that we're facing, and there's a lot of fear around them. But what does fear do? Fear makes you avoidant of something. I don't think
Right.
fear is the basis. If we have contact with nature, we get to love it, and we protect what we love. And I think there's a primary factor here that nature guided therapies, ecotherapies are primarily therapeutic. They're about helping a person work
Mm.
through when they come into our office and say, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm having relationship problems, I'm dealing with issues of abuse, or whatever that might be.
Mm.
So the therapeutic goal is a prime goal in, nature-based therapies.
Mm.
But I think there's a spin-off of that, and a secondary one, that if people are getting in contact with nature, then they're starting to love it and wanting to preserve and protect what they love. There's a lot of awareness of this now. A lot of research. Professor Thomas Astle-Burt from University of Wollongong has done some great research in this area, and a very vocal advocate on greening cities and the benefits of greening cities.
Mm.
And these build the community bonds too that you were mentioning about. Having rooftop gardens, having community gardens, having parks available that have a quality that make people want to go out in them and walk in them and be part of them. These things are important for us, and the research is showing that very, very clearly.
Mm.
Cities are doing things. I mean, Singapore recently, where they've had a huge concrete canal to take the water around part of the city there, have now changed that and ripped out the concrete canals and greened it. I
Wow.
forget how many hectares they've got of that space, and something like a 3 kilometre walkway through this. But now there's babbling brooks, there's bushes, there's trees. People are coming into the area, they're socialising in it, they're connected from a very huge city.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of potential for us to be doing these things, and yeah.
I know. I almost feel myself breathing out with a sigh of relief as I can see the image you're building, the cement canal being removed, and the pebbles and bushes and babbling water. Then the animals it attracts and the people, it just feels more peaceful.
Yeah.
I can feel myself breathing out in relief just even thinking about that possibility.
Yes.
Lovely. Oh, thank you so much, George. I've really, really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, me too. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Oh, you must. I guess, does it feel like there's a little bit of a resurgence that people like me are all of a sudden contacting you and say, hey, you put that book out and it seems to be happening now? Does that feel like it for you?
Yes, it does, and you can't believe how much joy I get out of knowing that this is spreading so much. I have as you know, a workshop coming up in May in South Australia, and people are wanting to know more about this. We're having this conversation now. I've just recently written an article for a new book in the area of hypnosis, based on using nature-guided processes with hypnosis, a chapter for that book. There's this nice level of interest, and I think part of the issues of the planet that we're experiencing has maybe triggered that to some degree, which is a helpful thing to have come out of it.
Take the silver lining. And interestingly, John Seed has been saying the same since our chat a few months ago. I've noticed I've been following some of his things, and it's the same. His workshops are selling out. In the old days, he was out there trying to get people to come along, and we can't keep up anymore, which is just great news.
That's great.
Yeah, that people are, looking back to that connection and seeing how they can. Well, I still have an activist kind of aspect. I'm nowhere near the political rabble rouser I used to be, but I still think. Hey?
Snap.
Yeah, well, but I still think it's good to be able to talk to people. You've mentioned it a few times, and whether you meant it or not, that people will work to protect what they love. That there's that aspect of more respect for nature that we all knew it was due, that people are waking up to. So
Yeah, and when you say about that, I look out my window at Point Peron. There was a proposal a few years ago to dig that out, to put in a canal development and 5-story hotels on that. This is a part of land that was given by the Commonwealth back in the 60s to the state of Western Australia to remain a park for the people of Western Australia forever. I think there are about 17,000 people joined in this campaign that was able to stop that development and preserve it. So you get that volume of people really wanting to protect and look after the environment that's important to them. Yeah, so maybe some of my activism is still there.
Yeah, I don't think it ever disappears, but I guess it's about for me, it's just more important now to just reconnect people. I just saw that was getting down to that root base and realizing that lecturing people only goes so far, but love goes a long way. And it's a big machine that, that we're up against. It's often very helpful to look away from the damage and to say, what good things can we do? Come back to that grassroots and, and that makes you feel better. It sustains you, and that's it's a good outcome. So often we can have good outcomes if we just look in that direction, which you've signaled towards that a couple of times.
Yeah, I think you're very right, Geoff. It sustains and it empowers too, I think.
Great. Well, that's a lovely place to finish. So sustaining and empowering nature, of focusing on the good things in nature and reconnecting to it.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much, George. We'll leave a couple of those links in the information below, ladies and gents, if you want to have a look at the Bhutan project especially. And hopefully we get to talk again, George.
Oh, I look forward to that, Geoff. Been a pleasure indeed. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for watching, and please consider liking this video. And if you want more content like this, subscribe, and the nature calling bell will toll for you. This is Geoff signing off.